So I'm a fourth-year PhD student working with Jost and Knowles. We do mostly research in political psychology, such as how ideologies and specific political ideologies are formed. And in this particular case, my research has to do with the Puerto Rico colonial situation and how Puerto Ricans and US Americans think about them, and how they form their own ideological beliefs about this, and how that informs us to understand the political status debate that is either becoming a Puerto Rico independent nation or becoming a 51st state, for instance. So today I'm just going to provide you a brief overview and new findings from my research program on the Puerto Rico political status question, where I provide a decolonial perspective on support for Puerto Rico statehood from both sides of the issue, that is from the Puerto Rican people in Puerto Rico and from US Americans. And with that, let's start. So my first research project conducted in Puerto Rico proposes a decolonial and system justification perspective, looking at the role that internalized inferiority has in the legitimation of the colonial system in place, and how this process predicts political status preferences among Puerto Ricans. So we first sampled 344 adults in San Juan. The data collection was between 2017 and 2019. And as depicted in this path model, which pretty much summarizes our results, we find that colonial system justification, that is the belief that the colonial system is fair, just, and legitimate, mediates the association of internalized sentiment of inferiority of Puerto Ricans in relation to US Americans. And that mediation leads to support for maintaining the colonial situation in Puerto Rico among Puerto Ricans, but also to lead to an enhancement of the system via Puerto Rico statehood. Only the lack of this internalized inferiority sentiment among Puerto Ricans and the ideological rejection of the colonial system in place mobilizes Puerto Ricans to support national independence. We also replicated this with a sample of 6,000 Puerto Ricans across the island. We also expanded our results looking at effects of acculturative processes, where we find a main effect of Puerto Rican cultural identity. Here in the x-axis, we have the Puerto Rican cultural identity, intensity or strength. And then on the red and blue lines are the strength of American cultural identity. So our main effect reveals that as strength of Puerto Rican identity increases, support for Puerto Rico support for Puerto Rico statehood decreases drastically. And as predicted, also, we find a significant interaction where those who integrate the American cultural identity alongside with the Puerto Rican cultural identity, that is bicultural Puerto Ricans, their levels of support for statehood increases. So what about the other side of the colonial issue on this topic? Let's turn to the American side of the issue, how they ideologically form their own opinions and their preferences towards a Puerto Rico status resolution. In general, there's strong support for Puerto Rico statehood among US Americans. Recent polling on US Americans have documented that as much as 2/3 of Americans support Puerto Rico statehood. And among those, 80% are Democrats and around 45% are Republicans. So it's mainly driven by a Democrat sentiment, but also Republicans are more or less split, not sort of opposed to the idea of Puerto Rico statehood. So to answer our research question, we propose some guiding premises. Some of it, number one, is that Puerto Rico statehood may represent a symbolic gesture for US Americans in regards to the colonial situation of Puerto Rico. We could incur to little to no cost to the majority of group of US Americans, and that could be conceived as being politically beneficial or instrumental for a specific partisan group, let's say for upcoming elections in Congress or for presidential elections, depending on the makeup, right, of the Puerto Rican political electorate. So we draw from this theory developed in New Zealand, specifically investigating colonial ideologies in the native Maori people and European New Zealanders context, where they talk about the existence of these two ideological constructs. They're thought of as being complementary colonial belief systems that either deny the relevance of colonial history to contemporary inequalities or exclude colonial subjects culture from the subordinate national identity. So that is the historical negation and symbolic exclusion. Although past research have found that they're possibly correlated, there's also a hypothesis called the Moral-Credentialing Hypothesis that tells us that some members of the dominant group will express low levels of symbolic exclusion in order to license their unrestrained endorsement of high levels of historical negation. These are the neo-colonial ideological strategies that we call, which in summary, their low levels of symbolic exclusion allows them to focus away from material-based reparations and actual process of decolonization. So think about it as this, most people score low in one and respectively score low in the other. Some people score high on this ideology and high in the other one, but we're talking here about that combination simultaneously of scoring high on historical negation, at the same time you score low on symbolic exclusion. You can think about this among the political spectrum in the US as perhaps a more progressive part of the Democratic Party. You can think of the highs as maybe the most conservative side of the Republican side. And maybe just think about more a centrist, more moderate Democrat who is willing to support symbolic aspects of the colonial group, but at the same time focus away or is not too committed to material-based reparations. So we set out to identify these groups in an amateur example of US Americans. And indeed, we find the existence of these clusters of people who score high and low in these two ideologies simultaneously. So they do exist. So hypothesis one, we can move on to hypothesis two. We wanted to see that both of these groups will support levels of statehood at the same level. And that is also true across three samples, one adult sample and two NYU student samples. And so there's two motives seems to be, one more symbolic, the other one more pro-egalitarian, that are leading to same levels of support for statehood. So we wanted to experimentally look at the role of political instrumentalization of Puerto Ricans, looking at specifically the effects of framing of Puerto Rico as becoming either a red state or a blue state, and how that will affect support for statehood among these two groups. So we recruited a prolific sample and randomly assigned participants to go through one of these conditions and to see if their levels of support for statehood and self-determination will be affected by the way that we're presenting them. Just quickly, this is what participants read: Republican frame condition. Participant read a small or short article depicting Puerto Rico as being a mostly Republican jurisdiction. Here, a map of Puerto Rico is just a red island. The same was true, or the same technique was used for the democratic condition. We basically just flipped the narrative, and now it's most Puerto Rican voters identify as Democrat. And then we have a neutral control condition where we just basically gave neutral information about Puerto Rico being an island in the middle of the Caribbean. And we again set out to find this group, and we do specifically in a Democratic sample, and we do find again that this group exists. There's people who score high and low simultaneously, and there's also people who score low and low in both these ideologies, colonial ideologies. So how they differ in terms of general support for statehood, given those different experimental conditions, we thought that there was going to be some difference, but we actually, surprisingly to us, found there was just main effects of Republican frame. So if Puerto Rico is presented as a Republican jurisdiction, both the more progressive and the more centrist group will retract the levels of support for statehood. And the same was true for support for self-determination, where both of these groups, again, either retracted or experienced a boost of support for self-determination when Puerto Rico was framed as being a democratic party. So we think this is some evidence to talk about political instrumentalizations, how some groups of Democrats or some ideological groups are levels of support for statehood as self-determination are dependent on their partisan gain that they could envision. So summary of our results, studies 1 and 2 were about Puerto Rican data. These are the things that lead to support for statehood. Study 3, we identify this group and 2 ideological process behind Puerto Rico statehood, one that is committed with both cultural and material-based issues, and the other one mostly more symbolic. But however, we do find that both ideological groups engage in some sort of partisan instrumentalization. That was a quick summary of my research in Puerto Rico, and most of my work is done under the supervision of Jost and Eric Knowles, who are from the Social Justice Lab and the Politics and Intergroup Relations Lab. And I hope that was informative. And if you have any single question, please, I'm dying to hear all your questions. Send me an email. Thank you so much.